On a dead spur in the Missouri Ozarks, a tin trunk turned up in an abandoned depot office. Inside were brass name tags, a night ledger that lists a train that never existed on any timetable, and a penciled phrase that turned one stop into two. Devil's Fork, 0213, placement car attached. The building had sagged so long the ticket window looked like a mouth gone tired. Men pried up a floorboard to run new wire and hit metal with a dull knock. The trunk was no bigger than a bread oven and stamped with a railway crest, half rubbed away by humidity. Tin warps, but the hasp still knew how to catch, and the smell inside was coal dust and old linen. The top layer held a bundle of blank destination cards tied with twine and a grease pencil wrapped in brown paper. Beneath it lay a depot night ledger, a sheaf of telegraph copies folded hard at the corners, and a cloth roll that clinked when lifted. The cloth unrolled into brass tags, round and small, each pierced twice and stamped with letters that had been hammered through from the back. Not names, not at first glance, initials and numbers. The way a mill pays wages in metal scrip, the way a railroad marks parcels that are not billed as parcels. On 3 of the tags the letters were unmistakable because the punchman slipped and doubled the cut. EM 14, RS 9, LT 22. The edges were polished smooth by fingers, not by machines. Whoever wore them did not wear them once. The night ledger was a different weight of paper than the company liked, thicker and smooth. The station's daybook had the usual lines for express, baggage, milk cans, the honest items that bring a small place its pennies. This ledger gave the night the same dignity: time, consist, special remarks. In ink, an uneventful week marched across pages with the calm of rails. Then a page began to argue with itself. The ink line stopped at 140, with a freight through town. A soft graphite line entered below them long after the ink had dried. 0213 stop, Devil's Fork, placement car attached, offloaded under lantern, switchman present. The graphite hand repeated the date and placed a small cross beside it, not a cross of grief, just the way clerks mark an entry that needs a second signature. The second signature never came. Telegraph copies lay folded in quarters and still held the press of the stylus. In the night's string of routine, 3 telegrams broke pattern. The first, from upriver, read, Freight 27 Clear Mill Siding 0158. The second, 6 minutes later, read, Freight 27, passing platform 0204, no delay. The third came from a mile beyond the depot. Bell, twice hand signal at Fork 0213, track time 1 minute. That last line did not belong to any message a station master would send. It sounded like a switchman's note, the kind a man writes on a copy sheet because his hands shake, and paper is all he has. A bell rung twice by hand in the small hours means human passengers without tickets. It is a rule you do not find in public timetables, but every old railroad man knows it. The trunk held a folded clearance card with the top edge torn, as if it had been pulled off a nail in a hurry. Printed fields named engineer, conductor, train number, and special instructions. In the blank where special instructions go, someone wrote orphan car in small cramped letters and then drew a line through it. Over the line, in a different hand and softer pencil, the words school car sat like a bandage. The card never left the office. It never received the company stamp that makes a word official, but it sat 2 inches from the brass tags and the night ledger that said the quiet thing out loud. Like every building that once moved people, the depot remembers by measurements. The platform boards still kept step, even warped, and the chalk hash marks on a post showed where conductors used to note car lengths while counting back for a switch. On that post, beneath 3 layers of tobacco spit and a century of weather, a faint date showed through where a boy with a pocket knife had cut what he thought a man would remember. The knife had bitten the 7 shallow and made the 9 too deep. 1897, a date the ledger gave in ink and pencil, and the post kept in wood. The depot's clock was nowhere. The brass siding ring that once held it left a clean circle on the wall, as if a lid had been turned and replaced 1,000 times. But the ledger made a clock, the freight upriver at 1:58, the platform at 2:04, the fork at 2:13. A consist cannot be in 2 places at once, not unless it stops in a place it is not allowed to stop, and not unless a car is added or taken without paperwork, meant for daylight. A minute is not long. Men move children faster than they move coal. The tags told a second story once the ledger had taught you how to read them. On the reverse of RS09, a scratch mark shaped like a house roof appeared where the brass had taken a blow against wood. On EM14, a loop of thread still clung through one of the holes, not cotton, but wool, the kind you find in a child's winter collar. LT22 carried a black stain around one edge where oil had weighed into metal over time. The stains had different lives, but the letters followed the same steel alphabet. You can tell a factory stamp from a local punch. These were local. The misalignments were human, not machine. Under the ledger, a ticket strip for school freight appeared, the little tooth-edged paper, a station tiers from a roll, when sending crates of slates and chalk to a district farther down the line. On the back of the strip, someone had rubbed a pencil over a plate to lift the relief of letters. The letters were not the railroad's at all. They belonged to a cast iron sign that had been unscrewed and replaced, because the rub showed holes in new places and old letters buried beneath fresh paint. Devil's Fork was the top line. Beneath it, in ghost letters, something longer lay erased except for a curling tail of an S and the cross of a T. Renaming matters. You rename a place when you need people to forget the last schedule and believe the new one. A lantern wick lay at the bottom of the trunk, dry and stiff. It was dipped in whale oil once and later in mineral spirit that gave it a cleaner burn. One end had been scorched black and cut fresh, the way you prepare a flame to throw light hard for a short time, then snuff it and let the night take the rest. The ledger's line, off-loaded under lantern, did not invent itself. The light you aim for a minute does not ask questions about names on tags. It asks whether small boots have found a plank with a crack they will not catch on. People will want a villain quickly, but the trunk offered only work. The penciled hand that wrote 213 had a habit of lifting before the tail of a 3, the way a man writes when his wrist is cold. The brass tags wore the polish of days more than the shine of a ceremony. The telegraph copies bore the dent of a stylus pushed harder than necessary, as if the sender expected an argument and wanted the paper scar to carry weight. The clearance card said the forbidden 2 words and then covered them with 2 safer words, as if a second voice had leaned over a counter and found a way to make the first voice legal. There is a corner in every small office where a tin cup of spare hardware lives. In this office, the cup still held 3 screws, 2 washers, and a label tack. The tack matched the holes on the rubbed sign. The screws did not. They belonged to a different weight of iron. Somewhere between 2 summers the station had changed a nameplate and a practice. Somewhere between 2 winters a trunk had been slid under a loose plank and left for whichever century would have the stomach to open it. A freight cannot be in 2 places at once. A ledger cannot talk a car into being, but a minute on a dark platform can be stretched by a lantern, and a car can be attached or detached without the blessing of a timetable, if the men on the ground understand that what is being moved is not freight the company likes to name. The trunk gave a word that could be written in pencil and denied in ink. Orphan car. Then a word that could be stamped. School car. If brass has a better memory than paper, it is because brass sits against the skin and listens. The last item in the bundle was a shift chit torn from the back of a pay envelope. It listed 3 names, a date, and 1 line underlined twice. 2 at the fork, no tickets, conductor's bell by hand. That line was not meant to outlive the night. It did, folded tight in a trunk, meant for nails and rags, because someone put it with the ledger and the tags and the rubbed sign, as if to say this is how it really went, even if no one will print it. The trunk did not ask for belief. It asked for a clock and a map and a length of platform to be measured without letting daylight rules erase the shapes that a minute can hold. Railroads hate improvisation. They live by inches and minutes, by mileposts and whistles that tell a crew how to behave in the dark when the station lights are out, and the only honest thing on the landscape is time. That is why the absence of Devil's Fork on every printed timetable is not a mystery, it is a statement. And that is why the single penciled line in the night ledger is not romance. It is a fight with a clock that the company would rather forget. Start with the timetables. The public card for that quarter shows the freights as a spine of numbers, exact as a metronome. Upriver branch through at 1:57, local milk at 2:41, no scheduled stop between depot and the next town until 3:10. That card is what a conductor shows a passenger when a complaint needs quieting. The employee timetable, which is the one that matters after midnight, carries the same spine but adds special instructions, speed restrictions on trestles, rule codes for hand signals, the distance between whistle posts and platforms. No Devil's Fork. Not in pencil, not in ink, not in the addenda that clerks slide under glass when the wind changes. Now place the telegraph copies found in the trunk beside those timetables. At 1:58, the upriver operator marks Freight 27 Clear Mill Siding. At 2:04, the depot copy reads Freight 27 passing platform, no delay. At 2:13, a third hand writes Bell twice hand signal at fork track time 1 minute. If the public card is a promise, the wire is a confession. 6 minutes takes a consist through the platform at speed and out beyond the lanterns. 9 minutes more and somebody has rung a bell by hand at a place the book does not name. A double ring by hand is not romance either. In those years, 1 bell from the engine told a brakeman to stop, 3 taps from the caboose to back, and a double from the platform meant human passengers with no tickets, children, soldiers, the sick, when a stop was not authorized. The map says nothing about Devil's Fork, but the ground does. Walk the line past the depot, and you find the old whistle post, a cast-iron W set to warn engineers to sound before a crossing. The post at the first road is where it should be. Between that post and the second, at a gap where no road ever ran, the soil carries a series of short, tamped rectangles just off the ballast, evidence of a flag platform, boards laid for feet, not freight, long since pried up and burned but leaving their ghost in compacted ground. 15 paces farther stands a milepost that should read 142. It reads 142 all right, but the paint beneath the paint shows the back of an F when the light hits right, as if the post once carried a letter and forgot to take it off completely when the number was freshened. Posts lie, they age, but they age in layers, and layers tell on you. A train cannot stop where there is no water to make up steam and no coal to feed the fire, not on a grade, and not if a conductor hopes to keep his job. The coal book in the depot, Rhodes would have loved it if he ran a railway, lists the shovels tossed into the firebox by the hour for each consist, and the tender filled twice nightly when engines took breath. On the night the ledger grew a pencil tail, coal consumption is light between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. A contradiction until you look at the water column log from the next town. Their column shows a short draw at 2:31, 5 minutes shy of schedule, which means the engine drifted a stretch on a banked fire to cover a stop without advertising it in coal. Drift is what you do when you are trying not to make smoke and not to wake a man with a lantern who stands where a schedule pretends there is nothing to see. Insurance maps, the kind that burned kitchens and flooded basements care about, are fussy in a different way. The fire insurance atlas for that year shades depots in salmon and marks tank houses with neat circles. At our depot, the tank is present, the platform proper is present, and the siding is measured to the foot. A quarter mile past the platform, where the ground remembers boards, the atlas shows wood stack, temporary, removable. They do not draw removable things unless someone paid to list them. People do not pay to list a wood stack unless it keeps a practice alive. If wood stood where a platform had been, it stood because men lifted children from a car and wanted to warm hands before the next mile took breath out of them again. The company map in the dispatcher's office shows a clean line, but here is a stubborn piece. An older strip map, the roll a section chief carries to measure curvature and grade, has a faint pencil spur drawn to a scribble that looks like a fork. A later hand erased it crosswise. Paper never truly forgets. If you wet a fingertip and pass it over the smudge, the graphite lifts just enough to show a knuckle-shaped bend in a ditch line and a note: drainage, muddy in fall. No conductor needs a ditch diagram. A man who builds a temporary platform in a wet season does. Clocks are cruel to stories. The railroad kept two. Standard time, Chicago time on this line, disciplined watches by the minute, but telegraph time ran by the click the moment a stylus struck and the copy boy bit paper with a pin. The upriver clear at 1:58 and the platform pass at 2:04 match a train at 23 miles per hour between the siding and town. Slow for a freight unless a crew expects to take a man off the car, add a car, or look for a hand signal. The fork at 2:13, with a 1-minute track time, answers that expectation. A single-minute irregular stop with no paperwork is a cut and pin. Uncouple one car, pin another, or set a coach with shuttered panes where cargo ought to be. The telegraphist in the next mile post office wrote, "Bell twice hand signal," because he heard it, and because writing it into an empty blank made him feel like he had done something honest in a night built on pretend. Peak, the walk at 2:13. We walked the distance with a railroad watch set to the old division time, starting on the platform where the ledger's ink line stops. Each minute is a geography if you let it be. Minute 1. The rail hum thins, and the cinders underfoot turn finer, the way they do where crews coast. Minute 2. The ditch on the right deepens exactly where the strip map once sketched a fork. Frogs keep their own watch and go quiet in a belt 12 paces wide. Minute 3. A flat of compacted earth, the length of a baggage car, lies to the side of the ballast, and 2 spikes, bent and lifted, sit like teeth in the dirt where a temporary platform would have needed bracing. Minute 4. A cedar stump with 2 old nail holes at a height a lantern hook would like. Minute 5. The first whistle post of the next crossing glints, and the milepost stands where it should, with the faint tail of a letter still sleeping under whitewash. This is not proof by proclamation. It is a minute doing work. A schedule can pretend to be a law until a switchman writes with a cold wrist. The depot's switch list for that month, carbon copies pressed into a leather pad, shows no work at the fork, ever. But in the margin of the copy beneath the penciled 213, someone has tucked a split pin so small it would fall through a floorboard if handled roughly. A split pin is what you jam through a link and pin coupler when you want it to hold for a minute more than it wants to. A railroad that has moved to automatic knuckles still keeps pins around because people still do the old work when the new equipment refuses to fit old habits. The presence of a pin in a ledger is not a romance either. It is a confession that hands needed help and did not have time to go upstairs for a rule book. Engineers are tyrants about grade. The slope here is a patient 1% northbound, a place a freight can stop without trying to roll the wrong way if the crew minds the brake. The railhead shows a polish that ends abruptly across a span the length of one passenger coach, then returns to shine. Rails polish under weight. They dull under drift. A car that sat while a crew counted heads and took a breath will dull metal more than a car that rolled without putting weight on a spot. Kneel and you can watch fine sand, spread to improve traction, caught in the low grain where wheels once bit down harder than a drift would require. Why would a timetable refuse a name that the ground says exists? Because names on paper litigate themselves. Call a place Devil's Fork, and you are telling a story someone can subpoena. Keep the place a gap between whistle posts, and you have only minutes to argue about. Minutes disappear. They evaporate under mourning. A school car becomes a freight on paper, and a stop becomes track time 1 minute, which is to say nothing happened except enough to make the next mile a little late and the water column a little thirsty. The final test is arithmetic. From the upriver siding to the depot is just over 2 miles. From the depot to the whistle post, near the erased platform, is another half. A freight at 23 miles per hour eats that first stretch in 5 minutes and the second in 1 1/4. Slow the last quarter to a walking roll, and you land at 2:13 with a bell in hand and a conductor's lantern shining a circle big enough to cover a plank, a child's boot, a brass tag, a breath, and a crew that wants to leave the night as clean as a timetable pretends it is. Maps refuse when they must keep peace with offices. Clocks betray when men allow a minute to hold more life than rules were built to admit. The penciled line in the night ledger is not a poet's flourish. It is a station calling a thing by the name it had in the dark, knowing daylight would take the word back. Some men keep almanacs. Some keep receipts. The man who visited the depot kept light. He was not a studio professional. His glass shows the compromises of a traveler who developed where he could and printed when the weather allowed. But habits survive inside chemistry, and they make witnesses better than memory. 3 glass negatives surfaced from a shoebox in the barber's back room, wrapped in newsprint that had turned the color of tea. The barber's grandfather kept a chair near the depot and cut crew hair on paydays. He also cut deals with drifters. One of those men traded 3 plates for a hot shave and a bed of towels by the stove. The plates we care about carry a corner crescent where a thumb pressed too hard when pouring collodion, and a faint diagonal lift along the top edge where a man leveled in a hurry. The same crescent and the same diagonal mark, all 3 exposures, one taken in late spring, 2 in autumn, 2 years apart. One shows a coach with shuttered panes coupled behind a freight car. One shows the depot platform with a crowd the size of a weekday market. And one, the most careful, shows the place beyond the whistle post locals never named in daylight. On the depot crowd plate, men face the lens in their work clothes. A woman holds a pie tin near her chest, like a shield. 3 boys wear identical ribbons threaded through buttonholes at the collar, 2 white, 1 black. The ribbons are not church-proud. They look like someone tied them in a hurry with what was on hand. A conductor stands to the edge of the frame, not quite willing to be recorded, holding a ring of small round tokens, iron or brass, hole-punched. In the stillness that a long exposure demands, even a ring of metal has a posture. These hang like a man has counted them many times. On the freight car's sill step sits a tin lunch pail with a chalk X on the lid. X marks a thing that should be taken and reused, not kept. The coach plate is fussier. A freight cannot be made to look elegant, but a coach expects it. The shuttered panes show a crosshatch of slats behind glass, crude and temporary. Standard coaches ran clear glass and curtains, not shutters, unless something needed to be hidden from lanterns and eyes. 2 pasting scars appear on the fascia above the car's number where one sign had been covered by another. A man who knows his letters can read under paint with his fingertips. A photographer does it with contrast. When printed, the scar under the new board shows the tail of an S and the cross of a T. In the exact slant the rubbing from the trunk suggests. The car's current board reads nothing, only a field where letters should be, a rectangle that says we decided to stop saying so much. The third plate, taken beyond the post, matters most. The lens sits low near the ground, as if the photographer knelt to rest his injured leg or to hide from a foreman who did not bless photographs. The ballast shows fresh rake marks. The shoulder where a temporary platform once lay shows footprints flattened as if someone had tamped with a spade, not a machine. On the right, a cedar stump with 2 nail holes stands at the height a lantern hook would like. On the left, a small hand touches the edge of the frame and then thinks better of it. The motion leaves a soft blur. Behind, near the ditch where the strip map once penciled a fork, a woman in a shawl lifts a child and then sets the child down. Because wet plate wants stillness, the lift turns that small body into a double, faint and then firm, 2 positions in the space of 1 second. Photographs lie about motion by telling the truth too slowly. You date plates by weather and by mistakes. In the spring image, a collar lies open, and a man's hatband shows sweat rings. The grass by the ties grows in sparse sprays, not the thick mat of late summer. In the autumn images, men wear stiff cuffs, and the wind pushes a rope under the coach in a way it cannot do without a northerly. On all 3 plates, the photographer poured collodion thick. Grain shows in places that a studio hand would keep smooth. He cut his plates from a larger sheet. The left edges carry scallop chipping where a glass cutter who didn't own the right wheel used a pocket tool. The chips match across plates, which means these were cut at the same bench with the same feed measure. Consistency is a kind of signature. Everything that can be faked about a picture was easier to fake when the tools were worse. But some things resist pretense. Light falls from a north window in a manner no oil lamp can copy. A bellied shutter edge reveals itself in a reflection a set dresser would never think to give. A Lincoln pin coupler carries a split pin shoved too far through and bent like a fishhook, a habit a brakeman learns by pain and forgets only when he stops working. The coach plate shows exactly that pin bent exact that way. 30 years later, the company would teach the knuckle everywhere, and a museum would label the old system unsafe. In 1897, a night crew had both on the same siding because the work got done however it could. There is also a face. On the depot crowd plate, near the edge where emotion is safest because it can pretend to be accidental, a girl looks at the lens with her chin raised, the way people do when they are trying not to cry. Her ribbon is white and tied on the wrong side for a practiced hand. Someone left-handed or hurried did the knot. 2 years later, in the autumn plate at the fork, a child with the same hair whirl stands on the tamped ground where the temporary platform lay, ribbon tied to the same side in a tighter knot, chin lifted in the same defiance that turns fear into posture. The face has changed because faces change, but habit has not. What photographs preserve best is not eyes or mouth. It is the things people do in every picture because they do them every day. A skeptic will look for props, and the plates oblige. The ring of tokens reappears in the coach frame. Bad news for any theory that the barber staged a carnival of objects to sweeten a story decades later. The ring hangs on the coach grab iron, cropped by the edge, as if a conductor needed his hands and hung the ring where he could snatch it again. The tin lunch pail with the X moves from the freight sill to the platform, lid open now. Inside, round flat bread and a wedge of something wrapped in cloth. People feed children in crisis with things that can be eaten standing up. The photographer left a note in chemistry that he did not intend as a note. On the fork plate, a light leak kisses the lower right corner, triangle sharp, the mark of a dark slide that was not seated fully. On the depot plate, the leak is absent. On the coach plate, the leak is small. Anyone who has worked a field camera knows that leaks travel with gear, not with stories. The triangle matches a small split in the slide velvet on the wooden holder found in the barber's attic beside the shoebox. He kept junk the way a man who never throws away something that still works keeps junk. The holder's velvet is patched with waxed thread in exactly the place the triangle wants it patched. If the plates are honest, they need to talk to other honest things. The brass tags from the trunk answer them. On the coach plate, hanging from a child's shawl edge, a small bright circle sits where thread would go through a tag hole. The line is too thin to carry a whistle or a charm. It is the thin cord you use when fabric will not support a heavier tie. You cannot read letters on a negative without guessing, but you can read where. The edge of that bright circle shows a polished crescent where a small hand has worried at metal until it learned how to stop. Printed, the fork plate shows a sign board on a post with fresh nails and damp wood that has not yet grayed. It is blank. Underneath the blank, when the print is angled, raised letters from an older board shine like the bones of a face under a smile. If you rub graphite on the back of the print and lift, the relief appears. A tail of an S and the cross of a T, the same ghost the clearance cards rubbing found. Photographs are poor gleamers of ghosts unless the ghost is embossed. Here, the embossing is literal wood and light does the rest. The last thing the plates give us is time, the kind of time that can be counted. The depot plate shows a clock behind the ticket window with the minute hand on the 2, and the shadow angles on hats, like the hour, were just past noon. The coach plate shows lantern light on metal with smoke drifting left, the direction the north wind takes in fall after midnight. The fork plate, taken at dusk or dawn, shows no lantern flame but a long exposure, the kind that makes water look like silk and people look like promises if they stand still. The child's double shape gives us 1 second of lift and set. The rake mark's crispness gives us 1 hour since last use at most. A story can take liberties with adjectives. It cannot fake seconds and hours without leaving fingerprints in shadow and shine. There is a notion that photographs prove too much or nothing at all. These prove enough. They place a shuttered coach behind freight where no coach belongs, show tokens and ribbons used like accounting rather than ornaments, and catch a blank board with a ghost name beneath it in the exact slant a rubbed clearance card suggested. They tie a girl's habit of tying a ribbon to a place and an hour, then tie that place and hour to the tamped ground we measured in minutes in the dark. If the company wanted the night to be a smooth line through a quiet mile, the plates say a line broke and a minute opened. And in that minute, a camera did what cameras do best, make the ordinary facts of hands, wood, metal, and light refuse to be argued away. Courthouses hate to say orphan. They prefer guardianship, placement, apprenticeship, words that keep faces out of sentences. Mills hate to say child. They prefer hand, boy, helper, words that fit in columns beside weights of flour and cords of wood. When the depot's trunk gave us brass tags stamped with initials and numbers, the next honest place to look was where paper turned small bodies into labor. The county packet for '97 sat under string in a drawer labeled Overseer of the Poor. The top sheet was a form indenture printed in blue-gray ink with a watermark that read, Standard Bond, Liberty Mills when tipped. Bond paper meant for accounts, not lives. 2 lines mattered most, placed in the household of, and until the age of 18. In the margin, a hand had written in pencil, then traced in ink, 3 letters we already knew, E.M. The surname that followed was scraped so carefully the fibers had lifted in a crescent. A clerk had drawn a neat replacement over the lift. Anyone who has ever boiled an egg and peeled it knows the look of skin lifted and pressed back down. Behind it lay a notice of credit for coal and shoes, $3, issued to a widow who lived near the depot. Proof that a placement pushes supplies as surely as it moves a child. The same widow's name appears in the poor book 2 months later with a smaller credit and a note, child moved. County paper never writes why. It writes where and when and leaves why for front steps. If EM left one house for another, the brass tag with EM-14 makes more sense. A head count inside a practice that had more motion than the county liked to admit. Mills keep better math than counties. The ledger of accounts, Ozark Roller and Feed, showed 3 columns that matter. Hands, issue, redeemed. Issue listed scrip, metal, and paper tokens stamped with the Mills name and a denomination, redeemable at the company store. Redeemed tallied what came back to the office window at the end of the week. Hands linked a number to a foreman section. Names appeared only when a man demanded them. Boys were often numbers and a note. Under tutelage. To water boy, to sweep. In September of 1999, a line reads, Hand 22, issue 40 cents, redeemed 0. A week later, Hand 22, issue 60 cents, redeemed 10 cents. On a scrap pinned to the page, someone wrote, lace for boot, the same scrap we saw lying in the depot photograph's lunch pail, now given in economy. Script feels different in the hand than coin does. It is too clean, too light, too obedient. In a tin cigar box the foreman kept, we found 3 discs stamped OR and F 5 cents, and 1 stamped 10 cents, all with a small side punch meant to hang on a ring. One disc carried a notch too wide, as if a larger wire had cut through a thin spot in haste. The notch's shine matched the polish we saw on the brass tags, 2 metals worn smooth by the same habit of being handled too often by hands too small. The barber who traded a shave for glass had kept a ring of tokens on the coach grab iron to count. Here, the foreman kept the same ring to pay out. Peek, the window. Imagine the window at quitting time, a slot worn smooth by elbows, a ledger open to the week, a ring of script ticking like a small clock. The foreman calls numbers, not names. 14, a head appears, a hand extends, a tag chain flashes. 22, the same. Now imagine a week when a boy is called by 2 different foremen because a placement moved without the county's ink catching up. The same initials on a tag, 2 sections on a sheet, script issued twice because someone needed someone, and no one wanted to walk upstairs to argue with an overseer. The math fixes itself eventually, or it doesn't. Either way, a boy learns to answer in the place that feeds him. Paper follows when it can. The insurance register piled next to the mill ledger had its own blunt sentences. Minor injury, crushed finger, no physician. Eye irritated by dust, rest 1 day. Lash burn, rope. Rope appears in a mill as often as it does on a platform. It lashes crates and brakes and wrists. One entry read, lash burn, guard, number. 9, with a parenthetical school train, written beside and crossed out. Someone started to connect an injury to a phrase that does not belong in a factory book, then thought better and put the ruling word in, guard. A guard protects a belt. A school does not exist on paper, even when it does. Counties that do not want to write orphan will write apprentice. The courthouse packet included 2 apprenticeship papers printed on the same Liberty Mills bond, witnessed by a notary whose stamp left a clean, round bite. Both carried the same date. One apprenticed a child to a wheelwright upriver. The other apprenticed the same child, same initials, same margin flick of the clerk's hand, to a miller. The second was written in a lighter hand and carried a note at bottom, first canceled, signed only with initials. If we allow mistakes to explain everything, we do not need to think. If we allow pressure to explain two paper paths for the same body, we need to ask who applied it. Mills needed hands. Wheelwrights paid cash. Counties owed housing, shoes, coal. Nothing in those sentences contradicts the night ledger entry that said a car stopped where it did not officially exist. Placement drifted like water rights to whoever stood where the water was. In the church book that still had a lock and a key, because the parish was tired of men with hot opinions, a deacon had written children's names under catechism for spring and then trailed off in autumn with 3 initials and no dates, as if the children left between lessons. In the same binder, a sewing circle list recorded measuring 7 collars, white, 4 ribbons, black, thick thread for tags, thread, ribbons. The photographs had already given us those words in metal and fabric. The sewing list gave them a moral. Women put names on cloth when paper cannot keep them. The state inspector's report, a pamphlet printed for the capital and mailed to counties, carried a paragraph about unauthorized placements in hill districts where guardianship is not executed before a magistrate. The footnote named no towns. It did mention one mill that had regularly accounted scrip to hands under the age of 14, contrary to advisement. Advisement is a thin word. It carries no penalty. A company that lives by inches and minutes can ignore a pamphlet if the foreman's pencil does not. The bridge between depot and mill is time, and the telegraph book solved it without trying. On 3 nights across 2 years, the mill whistle gave its long noon, even though the clock said night. One note held and dropped and held again, the pattern a foreman's call to gather or release a shift outside of schedule. The telegraph boy wrote the whistle out like a child trying to capture a bird. Oh, 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 oh. In the margin, the agent wrote, "Practice irregular. Remember barrels." Barrels are not children. Barrels are reasons to call men from beds. But barrels do not step off a coach under a lantern. Notes made by boys who listen too hard scoop up more truth than minutes do. The county treasurer's petty cash showed a new and odd rhythm after the penciled 213 night. Coal scrip from the mill redeemed more often at the courthouse store window, as if placement households, widows, men on old pensions, were paid in mill metal rather than county paper. A county likes its own money because it can count it without help. The treasurer took mill metal anyway, probably because no one turns away fuel in winter when the ledger says a child has been placed and the child has no boots that will survive February. One thin sheet carried the bluntest admission of all. Revocation, the top said, then reissue. The same initials, the same birthday counted forward by 3 years, the same sponsor name on one line, and a new sponsor name on another. The notary's seal had pressed too hard and left a bruise on the desk blotter. We found the blotter still tucked under a drawer. Paper moves like a body when it flinches. It creases in the place that suddenly had to carry weight. Someone had stood at that desk and argued until the sheet admitted what the night ledger had whispered, placed twice. The mill store ledger wrote what the courthouse would not. Biscuits to E.M., it said on a line that cost the company a nickel and the clerk a smirk, for long day. Below it, needles and thread, small for names. A school does not exist on a timetable. An orphan car does not exist on a clearance card. A devout county does not write child labor. But a store writes biscuits, a foreman writes scrip, a clerk writes a cancellation that no one was supposed to see, and a boy learns to answer to a number hung on a tag because the number gets him bread when a name gets him a lecture. A person inclined to charity will want a villain with a hat and a cigar. The paperwork offers only a network, a county that needed the mill's fuel to keep its placements alive, a mill that needed the county's silence to keep its barrels moving, a church that needed to keep its sewing circle busy with purpose that could be spoken in a parlor. The brass tags in the trunk sit at the junction. They belong to neither office and both. Metal listens to skin and remembers. When the depot's night ledger records a stop that did not happen and the mill's ledger counts script that should not have been issued, the tag around a child's neck tells the truth they cannot print. A minute opened by a bell, a hand paid in tokens for a week, a file that says once where the body went twice. Church basements keep better archives than courthouses when the story is small enough to embarrass everyone. The room under St. Jude's was cool even in July, the kind of cool that turns breath into patience. Women met here to measure other people's winters. They kept bolt ends of calico, jars of buttons sorted by color, and a wooden sign for sales they never finished painting. In a press cupboard sat a folded quilt wrapped in a flour sack with a pencil note on the outside, "Bridge, after Sunday," and a spool of black thread tucked into the sack's knot the way you tuck a pin into your sleeve when you expect to need it again soon. The quilt was heavier than it looked. The top was a simple 9-patch in brown, indigo, and a red that was too bright to be madder and too steady under raking light to be anything but turkey red. The cheap, color-fast red mills pushed on country stores because it would not bleed into the white no matter how hard you boiled wash. The quilting was hand-done, even and spare, the running stitch the circle always taught. Rock the needle through 3 layers at once, load 3, 4, 5 bites, then pull and breathe. The batting was thin and uneven, summer weight, not meant to warm, but to cover. Names had once lived on this top and been picked out. The eye does not see it first, the hand does. Your palm catches on a fine field of punctures that do not belong to quilting. When you turn the top oblique to a lamp, ghost letters rise like footprints under snow. The thread path shows itself in satin sheen, where it had been shielded from air until whoever did this pulled floss free. E-M lies along one patch's diagonal. A loop where a letter's tail had been knotted shows a faint dark where oil from skin soaked into cotton around a knot months or years ago. The backing tells the rest of the truth. At each place where a name once anchored, there is a tiny crescent of lifted fiber left by a seam ripper, improvised from a needle and a dull blade. There were 2 colors of floss in those holes. In the brighter patches, you can see the bruised trail of white thread that once lay there. In the darker, a black path. The sewing circle ledger, one shelf up in the cupboard, put the legend to it in 4 short lines. 7 collars, white, 4 ribbons, black, names for Sunday, bridge pot. The bridge pot was not a stew. The bridge was a place to gather, 3 planks over shallow water where the road drops out of sight of the depot lights. After Sunday was the day when people who could not be seen in the open still wanted a blessing to make their work feel like work and not theft. Peak, raking light. We set the quilt on the table under a low lamp and slid a piece of slate under one corner to tilt it. At the right angle, the picked-out names read themselves without thread. R-S, L-T, E-M. Not full surnames, only the letters we already knew from tags repeated in cotton where mouths could say them without making office paper dangerous. Women write names on things when books will not hold them. When those names become a risk, women pick the stitches out and leave holes for the right reader. On the quilt's edge, a label had been carefully lifted and re-sewn backward. The stitches that held it the first time lay shorter and tighter. The re-sewn line was longer, meant to be taken out again. The ink had run to nothing on the label, but someone had pressed the label once between 2 leaves of the sewing book and left a print the paper took. School. The S and H were weakest, the way ink weakens where a hand lifts to form a tall letter. The quilt had been intended to hang or lie in a place where the word could not be argued with. Later, the word became heavy, the label came off, the holes stayed. The stitch types caught the practice in motion. The names had been done in chain stitch when they were meant to be seen, little links that raise above the surface and read from across a room. The pickouts had been done with backstitch, small, stubborn bites that let a woman extract floss without tearing fabric to rags. The person who removed the letters knew what she was doing. She underrun the ends to keep the field from unraveling, snipped at knots she herself had tied months earlier, and saved each loop in a glass jar that now sat in the cupboard with a scribble on paper under the lid. Names? Done. 3 straight pins rusted into the batting where someone had driven them and then did not come back for them the same hour. 1 pin held a strip of ribbon, white turned bone yellow where oil and air kissed it, black, still black. White for things you can admit in a parlor, black for a house that expects to see sorrow when it sees a child. The barber's plates had shown ribbons on collars. The depot crowd wore them the way soldiers wear a code. The quilt carried them again, not as ornaments, but as sorting. If any document in this town deserves to be called a roster, it is this square of cotton. A courthouse list brings trouble after the fact. A quilt brings a child warmth the same night and a prayer said over, even if the person saying it is shy of paper. The sewing book made meanness gentle, collar for R-S too big, E-M attached with fishing line, L-T lace boot, names read. The same phrase the midwife used in her little pocket ledger, the same verb that the depot's nightline turned into a practice under a lantern. In one corner, a patch of turkey red had worn thin and showed the ghost of a manufacturer's mark when lifted to light. Sprague mill print, a common brand pushed into the Ozarks by the case in the 1890s. People who mended for both the depot and the mill bought from the same peddlers. That mattered because a story that rests on a single room can be dismissed as sentiment. A quilt that carries the commerce of the region in its weave ties the circle's practice to the economy that demanded it. Pinned to the quilt sleeve was a note written in a school hand on a sliver of copybook paper torn from the spine. Name Sunday Bridge, no priest. No priest is not contempt. It is logistics. The priest came when he could. The sewing circle could always come. They met in daylight to cut cloth. They met at dusk to finish what the county would not print. The black thread was for public sorrow, the white for names you hope to keep long enough to hide again. A skeptic would ask why pick names out if the quilt lived in a church cupboard, because cupboards are not vaults, and men look for labels they can argue with. Holes in cotton do not carry a charge. Holes are evidence for people with fingers, not for people with stamps. You can hold a quilt to the light at your own kitchen table and read what was once sewn there without starting a fight on the courthouse steps. A community that needs to signal without confessing uses cloth the way a timetable uses minutes, as a language with just enough grammar to carry a sentence and just enough ambiguity to keep a child from paying for it. At the quilt's exact center, the quilting pattern changed. The running stitch broke into a herringbone for a square no larger than a hand. Someone had stabilized a tear and then disguised the mending as decoration. Under that square, tucked between batting and backing, lay a paper scrap rolled tight and flattened by years of breath and weight. It named no one. It listed numbers in 2 columns and then 1 line. 2 after Sunday. 2 what? 2 tags returned. 2 children moved. 2 names read. The paper was too thin to survive any more handling, so we left it where the maker had left it, hidden, reachable, a secret that did not want to be taken to a desk. The edges of the quilt held hanging loops at 6-inch intervals, each loop sewn loose enough for a fence rail. The note on the flour sack, bridge, after Sunday, had not been a metaphor. This quilt had hung where the road and the creek and a line of sight intersected. It could be seen by anyone with eyes and read only by those who knew that holes were letters and that white floss and black were as loud as bells when you understood the code. Under a dusk lamp the holes gilded themselves. Under noon they went quiet. The sewing circle made privacy out of physics. They made records that rain could not indict. Near the binding, a grease spot looked out of place on fabric so carefully kept. Pressed with a warm iron and a blotter, the mark lifted enough to show lamp oil. Someone had carried this quilt from basement to bridge and back, lamp in one hand, weight in the other, one foot feeling for a plank crack, and the other wearing a boot with a lace we had seen patched once already in a photograph and once in a mill ledger. Stories hide in alignments more than in declarations. The quilt aligned with the ribbons on collars, the tags at necks, the tokens on rings, the minute at the fork, the pencil in the nightbook. If you need a moment to stand for all the others, it is this. The quilt tilted under a lamp, the letters without thread, rising in a room where women had taught each other not only how to sew, but how to unsew with care. That is not mysticism, that is technique. You use a fine needle to lift the floss under one leg of a chain stitch, you ease the knot through so the hole stays clean, you stroke the nap to lie down again, and you trust that someone who needs the name will find it in the light you chose. Men from town will say quilts are sentimental. They are wrong. Quilts are administrative in houses that cannot afford administrators. This one kept a list in a language that no office would accept and every kitchen understood. When a name became dangerous, the list erased itself without disappearing. The holes always knew, the sewing book always knew, the note for the bridge always knew, and on a night when a school car was not a car and a stop was not a stop, the quilt did exactly what paper would not. It held the names long enough for a bell to open a minute and for a circle to say them out loud. Trains make their own weather at night. Before you see a headlamp, you hear the rails sing and feel the cinders breathe. A railroad runs on that weather plus two instruments, a man with a lantern and a man with a key. If the Devil's Fork stop existed anywhere, it would exist between those two. The lantern man has a name. His grandchildren kept a shoebox of papers under a stove, and inside lay a folded affidavit from 1903. Asa Broom, section hand turned switchman, asking the company to pay a pension for 2 fingers lost to a coupler. The notary seal bruised the paper like a coin under cloth. On the back, where a man rests his thoughts while a clerk sharpens a pen, Broom had written a list in pencil to remind self for sworn. It read like a recipe. Throw west target /red, out /bell, twice by hand /flagman, south /cut pin, /coach off, /box on, /clear 1 minute. He had underlined 1 minute twice. No date, no place. Just the steps. A body knows when it must make a train, obey a minute that the timetable refuses to print. A railroad speaks by rules everyone learns without love. The 1890s book on this line, thumbed to velvet at Rule 14 for whistle and Rule 99 for flag protection, lives in the historical room today. But it lived in coat pockets then. 4 short calls from the engine meant brakes. 2 long meant release. A long and a short at night answered a signal from a lantern. Rule 99 makes men sheepdogs. If a train stops where it is not scheduled to, the flagman must go out with fusee or lantern to protect the rear. If there is no flagman to spare, a switchman plays the role for 60 seconds and hopes no superior arrives before the minute goes quiet again. The rule does not mention children, it mentions minutes and responsibilities. Telegraphists are the only people who hear a night twice. They hear the click and they hear what it does to a schedule. Their OS reports, on sheet, record a train when it passes a station to the minute. The upriver OS for the night we have been chasing reads, neat as sleep, no, 27-158. The depot OS reads number 27 by 204. There is no OS at the fork because there is no office at the fork. But a service scribble sits inside a packet of routine. Fork bell, twice by hand. Track time 1. The operator had no blank for that sentence. He made one by pushing his stylus so hard, the paper dented. Stylus dents are telegraph swearing. If you walk beyond the second whistle post, you eventually meet a washed-out switch stand base sunk crooked in the cinders like a tooth. The target on top is gone, but the iron collar shows two wear arcs, one for red, one for white. The places where a blade rubbed grooves into paint. The arcs are not even. Red wore deeper. That is what you would expect if a man threw the stand to stop more often than to go for only a minute at a time. The latch dog still bites if you press with a boot heel. Iron remembers what lawyers forget. Broom's grandchildren did not only keep paper. A switch key lay on a string in the box, brass worn thin, where it kissed a belt for 40 years. The bow was stamped A.B. A switch key is a private sermon. It tells you a man once owned a small authority in the dark. The key fit the stand's rusted lock with a protest, and then a click that sounded indecent in daylight. We could not turn it. Corrosion owns old iron. But the throw bar still had shoe polish where a boot had worked it on habit, long after paint had stopped mattering. Someone taught someone else to keep the ritual clean inside the grime. The affidavit that begged for a pension held the accident in 3 sentences. Night work. Link and pin. Missed signal on fog. 2 fingers lost. A clerk had scissored out a line below with neat defendant's calm. Against the light, the missing words bled back in shadow. Coach without passengers. No man who has thrown cars for a living writes coach without passengers, unless someone made him. Freight is freight. A coach is an argument. Asa Broom wrote like a man who could have been a teacher if the payroll had been kind. He dated his list of reminders in his own code, after Michaelmas, then a year. He made a tally beside the phrase, bell twice by hand, 4 marks for 4 nights. Men who lie to notaries do not keep tallies under words they invented. Men who remember for themselves do. Peak, the lantern trial. We borrowed a period Ad Lake lantern from a collector, tin bullseye lens, carbon-smoked globe, filled it with modern oil, and stood a watch to the old division time. At the depot platform, a man rang a handbell twice at 2:13, our second hand joined by a wire to the next mile, where another man kept his own watch to the same minute. On our side, a lantern arc, down right, up left, down right, dictated stop. A pause, a second arc dictated come ahead, a car length, a circle meant pin. The man at the next mile saw 2 stutters of light inside the cut and wrote the times on a card, 2:13 to 2:14. 9 minutes earlier, his upriver partner had written 2:04. 9 minutes before, that the siding wrote 1:58. We rebuilt a schedule from motion rather than paper and landed where the penciled night line said we would. A single minute stretched by hands. Telegraph keys are simple. A sounder speaks only 2 syllables, dit and da. No poetry at all, and yet operators treated them like old friends. In the upper depot office, the old relay still wore lacquer, where a boy had polished it because he wanted to be the man with the authority to tap back. We wired 2 battery cells, ran a makeshift loop to the next town, and at the minute the lantern completed its second arc, the other office sent an unofficial click. Not OS, not an order, just the shape of attention. We were cheating at ghosts, yes, but we wanted to know what a wire feels like when a man writes a minute into the dark and hopes the dark thanks him by keeping its mouth closed. The click sounds like any other click. The meaning hangs on the man who hears it. A man who burns his hands at couplers knows silence can be a rule too. In the company's discipline ledger, Asa appears once with a warning for talk in saloon re-routing. Routing is a religion. You do not preach heresies about it to men who buy you a beer. He had marked his oath with the line, "I will not speak further on after-midnight business." The clerk drew a triangle beside it and wrote, "Cleared." Cleared meant the man returned to work with his jaw shut. Asa's daughter kept a scrap of his that felt unimportant until the quilt had taught us to count holes. He had sketched the lantern signals he used when the fork needed a minute, 5 tiny stick men in a row beside a rail, each with a circle for the lamp and a mark over the head for boy. Not names, not even letters. Positions. He had labeled the stick nearest the switch guard, the one in the middle lad, and the last one mother. He wrote 2 after Sunday under the drawing and then scratched it out. The phrase moved from a quilt to a switchman's scrap with no escort. People borrow each other's calendars when a town decides a practice should feel blessed, even when it cannot be written. The company book insists stops must be authorized by train orders, paper written at a station, time-stamped, and repeated back with the word complete. We looked for such an order. There is none. What we found instead lives in the dispatcher's copybook, the carbon that catches the preliminaries. Men say before they say things that can live with the word complete. Need second, a dispatcher wrote once, next to the date the night ledger used. Second is slang for permission to protect a move that falls outside the page. The reply reads, use broom. No last name, no title. Just a man whose lantern word carried more weight among rails than ink did in the morning. There is a stubborn spot in this story where men from town ask for thunder and we have only patience to offer. They want an order on a printed blank signed by a great name. They want a villain whose cigar ash dots the line like snow. Instead, we have 2 arcs of light, 1 minute of track time, a split pin dent in a ledger, a switch stand with grooves deeper on red, a pension affidavit with a scissored line that keeps glowing under the slice, and a key that still stings the hand that turns it because a small authority can blister even after a century. The railroad runs on inches and minutes. The fork was an inch and a minute over and over until a practice learned how to stand without a name. Telegraph boys develop a superstition about the number 13. They do not like it on the sheet. The night we care for put 13 in the minute and 2 in the hour, and forced a stop between 2 posts that had no right to shelter it. The boy in the next town wrote the minute anyway, and then struck it because OS cannot carry feelings. Asa wrote his list anyway, and then tucked it behind a sworn paper he never meant to be read by anyone who did not already know what he meant. A lantern is a poor witness. It cannot sign, but it can make a man who will not write say yes with his feet. If you want to hear how a stop sounds when it is not a stop, put your ear to the rail at the fork at 2:13 in the morning on a night without wind. The hum will thicken into a low vowel just before the headlamp ghosts the grade, then break as the weight lifts off for a breath of 1 minute. The minute will taste longer than any other that night, and the rail will buzz again, the way a wire buzzes when a telegraphist leans a syllable into it he is not supposed to send. A coach without passengers is just a phrase cut from a paper. A minute with children is a geography any man can find if he knows how to read a lantern. People want a villain because villains are easy to finish. What the papers give is a machine made of small needs that stutter in the same direction until they sound like intention. Counties do not say orphan when they can say placement. Mills do not say child when they can say hand. Railroads do not say stop when they can say track time 1 minute. You do the math long enough, and the sum looks like policy, even if no one ever voted for it. Start with money in the plainest form. The county rate sheet for 1997 priced a child at 75 cents a week for board, coal, and shoes extra on remittance. The mill scrip ledger priced an entry-level hand at 40 to 60 cents in tokens per week for errands, sweep, water boy. Tokens that returned to the company store as bread, soap, lamp oil. On the treasurer's petty cash, coal chits flowed from the mill to the county window more often. After the penciled night in the depot ledger, a quiet admission that placements were being fed by a system the courthouse could not print. You do not need a conspiracy when your columns solve each other's deficits. Then, insurance. The county carried a blanket liability through a regional underwriter, 2 pages of exclusions and 1 paragraph that mattered. The county owed for injuries to minors in county-supervised placements. The mill carried its own accident fund, but the fund paid token sums and avoided cases not on company time. If a child moved from a county placement to a household tied to the mill, the overlap created a gap. No one wanted to admit supervision at the hour injuries were most likely to happen. A double placement, 1 in ink for the county, 1 in practice for the mill, kept the ledger clean while wrists and eyes learned the dull facts of dust and rope. Church closures and school terms added pressure without a villain. The parish ledger shows a winter furlough for the schoolmaster when the river ran too high and the roof leaked. A county that cannot keep a teacher from December to March will try to solve daylight with work after dark, not because men are cruel, but because barrels ship and wheat waits for no doctrine. The sewing circle wrote names for Sunday and Bridgepot because Sunday was the 1 hour when everyone knew where everyone would be. 2 after Sunday appears on a quilt scrap, a switchman's page, and the midwife's pocket, language that braided grace to labor so tightly you could not cut one without bleeding the other. Peek the rate table. Lay 3 sheets side by side, county rate, mill scrip issue, insurance circular. On the county sheet, circle 75 cents plus coal. On the mill sheet, circle 40 to 60 cent scrip. On the circular, circle exclusion when not on company time. Now add the railroad's penalty for an unauthorized stop, $5 fine to the conductor if written, nothing if never written. The cheapest path for everyone at the table is a minute at the fork that leaves no paper except the paper people keep at home. The county avoids declaring a second guardianship on a child that already cost coal. The mill gets hands without hiring children in daylight. The railroad loses a minute and avoids a memo. The moral price gets paid in kitchens and on bridges by people who will never see a rate table. The board minutes for the mill ran long the month after the orphan car line in the clearance card was crossed out and rewritten school car. Men in vests argued about barrel quotas and sackcloth, and then a short paragraph, arrangements with county to meet advisement. That word appeared in the state inspector's pamphlet we saw earlier. Advisement is a warning you can frame as compliance if you choose the right synonym. The minutes note, no juvenile hires in daylight, and then move to the price of steam. By daylight, then, they were clean. Night was a minute, and a lantern and a coach with shutters where curtains ought to be. Telegraph time helped because it blurred. Operators logged OS to the minute, but the gap between the click and the copy could be padded by an extra breath or tightened by haste, and no one punished a boy for a shaky hand at 2 a.m. The agents learned to harmonize the lie, a pass at 2:04 here, a pass at 2:22 there, and the mile between filled itself with a minute that belonged to no one. The strip map that once penciled a drain at the fork, and the switch stand with red worn deeper than white, show the lie had weight and repetition. Men do not wear grooves into iron by accident. The overseer of the poor was not a monster. He was a bookkeeper for hunger. His marginalia read like a polite weather report, pinned to a storm. Boots delivered, coal redeemed, child moved. He wrote reissue once over the same initials with a weak hand, and pressed the notary seal so hard it bruised the blotter. He lived under pressure that kept his job and a small town's face intact. Keep the word orphan off the page, keep the mills running, keep the church doors open when it was dry and the bridge safe when it was not. There is no glamour in that sentence. There is only the place where policy becomes posture. There were quotas even if no one said the word. The mill's barrel tally climbed after flood years, and the county's remissions for coal and shoes climbed at the same pace. Farm mortgages came due on a calendar that never learned compassion. The railroad's dividend needed freight, not rest. Between the lines, families took borders marked as placements to make ends meet, and placements moved from rooms where they cost cash to shifts where they could redeem scrip. A double placement is not a riddle if you put the rate table beside a barrel quota and count to 12. We looked for the meeting where all this was decided and did not find it. What we found were micro-decisions hardened by habit. A conductor writes school car over orphan car because the second phrase will get him called to the division office. A switchman keeps 2 after Sunday in his head because the women at St. Jude's say it that way, and because he wants the practice to feel blessed, not criminal. A foreman calls 14 instead of EM because a number does not invite a story at a window. A deacon writes names read instead of who stood where because a verb is less dangerous than a list. A clerk crosses out coach without passengers because passengers bring liability and explanation. A county treasurer accepts mill scrip at the coal window because it is February and he knows whose stove went cold. There is a dark glamour in pretending men in hats made one decision, and that decision explained a decade. The truth is tighter and meaner. The minute at the fork solved 10 small problems at once and asked kitchens to carry the debt. The quilt carried the names in holes that read themselves back under a lamp. The brass tags carried initials that would not wear off. The photographs carried shutter slats and tokens and a child's habit of tying a ribbon on the wrong side. Paper, county, company, church tried to carry polite words and dropped them when they became heavy. A farmer's weather diary gave away motive without knowing it. He wrote the year in 2 colors, brown ink for spring, pencil for fall, when ink froze in the pen. Under the week that aligns with the 213 ledger line, he wrote, "Boys to mill for night turn, barrels after flood, Mr. Harper's wagon late." Harper is the man who delivered the bell in our other story. Here he delivered children and sacks in the same breath of ink because the economy made them one sentence no matter how a parlor felt about it. The state inspector returned in 1999 with firmer words and named unauthorized placements after dark as improper. The pamphlet included a table of fines that would have ruined the county's remissions and made the mill's barrel price a joke. The following quarter, the mill minutes read, "Discontinue night coach, burden not commensurate." Then a wink of a phrase, "Use local arrangements." Local arrangements is the polite way to say that what happens at a bridge after Sunday is not the company's business as long as the barrels roll and the county window stays open. A thing becomes policy when people stop noticing that it stings. The switch key wore its bow thin, the throw bar carried shoe polish, the lantern globe smoked where someone trimmed wicks too fast for beauty. The double ring by hand at the fork was not a flourish. It was a work signal so ordinary a telegraph boy had to force it onto a line where it did not belong. The minute lengthened. The names shortened. The ledger learned to whisper what daylight could not admit. You can indict the county if it helps you breathe, or the mill if the smell of oil keeps you angry, or the railroad if you like rules. The quilt will not indict anyone. It will hold holes where names were and ask you to tilt it to lamp until the ghost letters stand up again. The brass tags will jingle on a ring and weigh less than they should. The photographs will keep the coach shutters closed long after the car rotted. The minute will still be there if you walk with a watch and enough patience to hear how rails and frogs and breath keep time. The reason is not a demon. It is a budget. The method is not a curse. It is a minute carved out of a night. The cost is not on a receipt. It lives in picked-out thread and children who learn 2 answers to the same question because one answer fed them and the other answer let a town sleep. The trunk gave us brass and graphite. The depot gave us minutes. The mill gave us metal that pretended to be money. The church gave us a quilt that could remember without thread. The switchman gave us a list he meant for a notary, and a lantern arc he meant for a night. All of it pointed to a single question that a timetable cannot answer. What does a stop look like when it is not allowed to be a stop? Begin with the simplest reconstruction, the parts permit. Freight number 27 clears the upriver siding at 1:58. At the depot, it passes the platform at 2:04, lanterns unbothered, bell silent from the engine because an engine bell would make the minute official. 9 minutes later, at the gap where the ground still holds the dull rectangle of tamped boards, a handbell rings twice, not the engine's bell, the conductor's quick, low carry. A lantern at the switch stand throws red. The target's paint wears that history. The throw bar takes a boot's weight and turns. Wheels complain into a slow, disbelieving roll. A coach with shuttered panes trails the freight like a thought no one will admit out loud. On the side of that coach, above the numbers a shop hand painted when the car took on its new life, lie two pasting scars where something truer once lived. A clearance card in a trunk wrote it, orphan car, and a softer pencil apologized over it with school car because school car can sit on a desk without someone being called to St. Louis. Inside, brass tags knock against brass tags when small hands shift their weight. And ribbons, white, black, find buttonholes that were never meant for them. A ring of meal tokens hangs on a conductor's belt, a rhythm he will count by morning as if it were wages and not food. The minute arranges itself like this because money has no patience for sunlight and children have to be somewhere at noon. The county ledger bought coal and shoes and then wrote reissue when a placement moved faster than a desk could. The mill ledger issued scrip and redeemed less, leaving the difference to a store window that knew who needed biscuits and lamp oil more than arithmetic needed elegance. The church ledger wrote names for Sunday and trained hands to write in holes so that the names could be read back without turning into an indictment. A stop that is not a stop gets its ethics from people who have to stand there. A switchman writes a tally underbell twice by hand and underlines 1 minute because in his life a minute at the wrong time has already taken 2 fingers. The telegraph boy pushes his stylus hard enough to bruise paper because he cannot bring himself to pretend the click he heard was nothing. A foreman rings tokens like a small clock and calls numbers instead of names because numbers go home with less friction. A deacon tucks a note into a quilt sleeve. No priest, not because anyone is defying heaven, but because heaven does not keep a timetable after midnight in winter. Peak, a minute in the open. We walked the yard long before dawn and set the artifacts on a rail like a ledger line. Tag EM14, a ring of OR and F script, a split pin from a coupler, the clearance card with the phrase someone tried to erase, a quilt square tilted to show letters without thread. Fog lay low enough to keep breath close. At 2:13 the frogs went quiet, the same belt we had heard before. A handbell spoke twice out of memory because all the bell ringers are gone. The rail did a poor imitation of the old hum. We held the lantern anyway, swung the arc anyway, and for 1 second the geometry of the place grew visible. The tamped earth where boards were, the cedar stump nail holes at the height of a hook, the blank board on a post with the ghost tail of an S, and the cross of a T showing under paint, when the light bumped it just so. Nothing mystical happened. Physics cooperated with the habits of people who had counted on physics to keep them decent. There was never going to be a naked confession in a depot drawer or a speech in a boardroom about a coach that collected children where no station existed. Policy in small valleys is not made by proclamation. It is made by minutes, by how far a lantern arc travels, by how many grooves red wears into a target, by how many times a notary presses a seal hard enough to leave a bruise on a blotter, by how many names a circle dares to sew and unsew. When a county cannot say orphan without paying for it, and a mill cannot say child without the price of daylight, men and women conspire without ever agreeing to the word conspire. They build a method, a car that is not a car, a stop that is not a stop, a list that gets shorter where a quilt gets heavier. The photographs hold the posture of the method without sentiment. A shuttered coach prints like a confession across emulsion. A ring of tokens hangs where a conductor put it down because his hands were already doing something that mattered more than gatekeeping. A tin pail with an X waits to be filled again. A girl offers the only look anyone can afford to offer a lens that might call names out loud later. The chin lifted a fraction, the ribbon tied on the wrong side, the way a left hand ties when right hands are busy moving the world. The last quarrel is with language. People ask whether the tags prove children were property. They do not. They prove someone solved a problem with accounting because names would not balance at windows. People ask whether the quilt proves religion. Bless the practice. It does not. It proves care found a grammar a courthouse could not confiscate. People ask whether the night ledger's pencil proves a cover-up. It proves a station man gave his own conscience permission not to lie to himself and expected the morning to remove the line for him. The line stayed because he put it in the wrong ledger, the tin trunks ledger, rather than the daybooks, and because someone decided that if a secret needed keeping, it needed keeping where someone kind might find it later. Every artifact keeps a second inside it. The brass tags carry a second of noise where two pieces of metal touch and invite a nervous hand to worry them. The quilt carries a second of quiet where a knot slides out and leaves a hole that can be read without words. The split pin carries a second of force where it wants to spring free, but a brakeman's pliers force it to bow. The clearance card carries a second of shame where a word is crossed and underwritten with a safer word that makes cowards of otherwise honorable men. The rail carries a second of weight that should not be there and will be polished dull in exactly the shape of a passenger coach, because for 1 minute, a day, a coach carried weight where only freight was supposed to. Those seconds accrete. They become rows of habits, rows of names, rows of holes. A county no one will remember with love, and a mill no one will remember with hatred managed to leave behind a practice that fed children who otherwise would have learned too young how perfectly empty the word placed can be. The price is not small. The price is obedience to a minute that will always need defending. The price is silence, paid at a bar by men who cannot afford to call rooting what it was. The price is a line in a switchman's affidavit cut with a scissor and shining anyway when you hold the page up to a window. The price is a girl who learns at 10 how to face a lens, and at 12 how to answer to a number, and at 14 how to read her name from holes because thread has become dangerous. If the car never stopped, why did the ground keep the shape of a platform? If the county never doubled placements, why did a notary bruise a blotter between revocation and reissue for the same initials and birthday? If the mill never paid children, why did a ledger pin a scrap about lace for boot to a line marked Hand 22? If the railroad never permitted a school car, why did a dispatcher write use broom on the night he should have written complete and go to bed knowing a minute was held open by someone else's courage? The artifacts do not shout. They arrange themselves in a logic that a town cannot quite deny and cannot quite apologize for, because in the arithmetic of winter and work, the minute solved more suffering than it caused. Cemeteries can be counted, minutes cannot. This story dies if you demand a stone for every sentence. It stands if you accept that men measured with lanterns and women measured with needles, and the sum they protected did what law would not. It kept a list alive in a valley that kept losing lists. The last line in the tin trunks ledger is not a flourish. It repeats the first, written in a steadier hand after years taught the writer where to breathe. Inventory of those entrusted to my care. A county will read entrusted and hear liability. A mill will read entrusted and hear workforce. A church will read entrusted and hear charge. The trunk made entrusted a wider word. A lantern and a quilt made it stand. Walk the fork once with no watch and once with one. Without time, the place looks like any other indifferent mile of rail. With time, the minute rises like heat off iron, and every ordinary thing aligns. The dull rectangle, the nail holes, the blank board's ghost letters, the grooves at the switch, the old split pin in a ledger where no pin should be. You do not need to hear a bell. You only need to know when you would have heard it if the crew had been yours, and the children had been yours, and the quilt had been your ledger, when paper would not take what the world put in your hands. If this held you, please subscribe and tell me one word in the comments that, for you, best names what that minute was.